Welcome to Sinister Stories. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for another spine-chilling tale. If you crave stories that send shivers down your spine and keep you glancing over your shoulder, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a new scare. There's always more lurking in the shadows, waiting just for you. Now, settle in, and let's dive into the darkness together.
I never thought working nights at a football stadium would be creepy. Honestly, when I applied, I figured I'd be mostly alone, cleaning, maybe checking security monitors for anyone trying to sneak in. The ad was simple enough: nighttime security needed. Flexible hours, high pay, benefits after 90 days. Sounded great. The job was at Midnight Stadium, a place that was always packed on game days. They told me I'd be starting off with a 2-week night shift rotation before moving to day shifts if I preferred. I didn't mind, so I signed the paperwork, and by the following Monday, I was starting my first shift. My boss, a wiry old guy named Hank, was the one to show me around. He had the kind of face that seemed permanently locked in a grimace, his expression carved by years of stress and whatever else came with managing this place. He handed me a laminated list of rules with a serious look. "Listen," he said, his voice low. "Stick to these. We've had incidents." I raised an eyebrow, scanning the list. It was long and honestly, kind of ridiculous. Night shift rules for Midnight Stadium. Do not enter the field between midnight and 3 a.m. If you hear cheering, check the nearest monitor, not the field. Ensure the field is empty. If you see movement in the bleachers, do not investigate alone. Call for backup. Keep the west corridor locked at all times, no exceptions. If you hear footsteps behind you, do not turn around. Every hour, look into the mirror in the visitor's locker room for exactly 5 seconds. Make sure your reflection blinks only once. If you see someone wearing a visitor's jersey in the halls, walk in the opposite direction immediately. The list went on, with a few more rules that felt stranger than the last, but Hank cut in before I could finish reading. "You got it?" he asked, his voice suddenly harsh. I nodded, more confused than anything. Maybe it was some kind of hazing thing, just to freak out the new guy. But Hank didn't seem like the joking type. That first night, I thought I'd follow the rules just to be safe. I made my rounds, walking through the empty stadium, hearing only the sound of my own footsteps echoing down the darkened hallways. There was something eerie about the place at night, though I couldn't quite place it. At midnight, I sat in the control room, my eyes glued to the monitors. The empty bleachers, the deserted field, it should have been peaceful, but an uneasiness settled over me. Midnight stretched to 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. Nothing unusual. Then, around 2:30 a.m., I thought I heard faint cheering. It sounded like it was coming from the field, but when I checked the monitor, the field was empty, just a stretch of perfectly mowed grass under the floodlights. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It was stupid, I knew. Empty stadiums make noises. Sound carries in strange ways. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At exactly 3 a.m., I headed toward the visitor's locker room for my hourly mirror check. When I stepped inside, the lights flickered once, and I shivered. I was just getting paranoid. That's what I told myself. I stood in front of the mirror and counted to 5 in my head, staring at my reflection. But just as I reached 5, my reflection did something I can't explain. It blinked twice. I know that doesn't make sense. I thought I'd miscounted or blinked without realizing it. But something felt off, like my reflection was lagging, just a millisecond behind me. I shook it off and finished my rounds without incident. I thought maybe I was psyching myself out, but I couldn't deny it. Something about this place wasn't right. When my shift ended, Hank was waiting in the break room. He raised an eyebrow at me. "Everything good?" "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual even though I felt anything but. I wanted to ask him about the cheering, about the mirror, but I didn't want to seem like I was freaking out on my first night. Hank seemed to sense my hesitation. "You followed the rules?" he asked, his tone sharper than before. "Yeah," I said, a little too quickly. He stared at me for a long moment before nodding. "Good, keep it that way," he said. "We've had incidents." He wouldn't elaborate, and I didn't push him. But as I left, I felt a strange sense of relief, relief I hadn't broken any of the rules, because something told me that would have been a very, very bad idea. On my second night, I arrived a bit earlier, hoping to get settled before the shift began. Hank was waiting for me, standing near the entrance. His face looked even more pinched and weary than the night before. "Ready for another night?" he asked, but it didn't sound like a question. More like he was testing me. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound confident. "I'll stick to the rules." He nodded, not smiling, but almost looking relieved. "Good. Just remember what I said about the visitors." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "If you see someone wearing a visitor's jersey, you turn around. Don't hesitate. Don't look at them. Just walk away." I felt my stomach tighten, but I nodded. I knew better than to ask questions I didn't want answered. By midnight, I was back in the control room, watching the monitors. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if something lurked just beyond the glow of the screens. The silence weighed on me, thick and oppressive, like the walls were closing in. Around 1:30 a.m., the silence broke. From somewhere down the corridor, I heard footsteps, quick, shuffling steps, echoing down the empty hallway. I tensed, watching the monitor closest to the sound. The hallway was empty, nothing out of place. I reminded myself that buildings like these settle, make noises. But the footsteps sounded purposeful, like someone or something was walking with intent. I stayed put, watching the monitor, heart pounding. Then, on the camera covering the west corridor, I saw a figure, a tall, lanky man wearing a faded visitor's jersey. He had his back to the camera, his posture slouched and unnatural, like his body wasn't quite sure how to hold itself. My throat went dry. Hank's words echoed in my mind. "If you see someone wearing a visitor's jersey in the halls, walk in the opposite direction immediately." I couldn't tear my eyes from the screen. The figure started to turn, his movements jerky, like he was moving in stop motion. I snapped myself out of it and turned off the monitor, my hand trembling. I wasn't supposed to look, but part of me wanted to understand what that thing was. Just as I started to get up, I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time closer. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the west corridor. I forced myself to keep my back to the door, my mind racing. "Don't look. Walk away." The footsteps stopped just behind me, as though someone or something was standing in the doorway. I took a shaky breath and forced myself to stand up, keeping my back turned as I walked down the hall. I kept my eyes fixed on the exit, each step feeling like it took an eternity. I didn't dare look back, even though every instinct screamed at me to see if it was following. By the time I made it to the visitor's locker room, my legs felt like jelly. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I entered, the familiar staleness of the room somehow comforting. I'd made it. I was safe, at least for now. I checked my watch, 2:59 a.m. Almost time for the mirror check. I stood in front of the mirror, taking a deep breath, trying to slow my heart rate. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Mirrors don't do anything. It was just a trick of the mind. The seconds ticked by, and I counted to 5 in my head, staring hard at my reflection. My eyes didn't blink. Everything seemed normal. But then I noticed something. There was a mark on the visitor's jersey reflected in the mirror. My reflection was wearing a visitor's jersey. I staggered back, heart hammering. The mirror wasn't showing me. It was showing the figure from the west corridor. But as I stumbled back, I saw something worse. The reflection smiled. Not a normal smile, but something twisted, inhuman. A cruel grin stretched across its face, wider and wider until it seemed impossible. I backed out of the room, my hand fumbling for the doorframe. I couldn't look away. The reflection's smile only grew, stretching to fill the entire mirror. It was like something from a nightmare, yet it felt terrifyingly real. I stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. The smile disappeared, but its imprint stayed with me, burned into my mind. My hands were shaking as I pressed my back against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I wasn't alone here. I knew that now. Whatever was in the stadium, it was watching me, following me, and it didn't appreciate me being here. When my shift ended, Hank was waiting again, his face unreadable. "Anything unusual?" he asked, his voice flat. I thought about telling him everything, the footsteps, the figure, the mirror, but something held me back, a feeling I couldn't explain. Maybe I thought he wouldn't believe me. Maybe I was afraid of what he'd say if he did. "No," I replied, keeping my voice steady. Nothing unusual. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression hard to read. Good, keep it that way. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on, and that the rules, they weren't there to protect the stadium. They were there to protect me. I returned the next night, my nerves still frayed from the encounter in the locker room. The stadium loomed in the distance as I parked my car, its lights casting eerie shadows across the parking lot. It felt like the stadium itself was watching me, waiting for me to step inside. Hank was there, waiting at the entrance like he had been the previous nights. He didn't say much, just a curt nod before I passed by. I could feel his eyes on me as I walked down the dimly lit hallways, and for a moment, I almost wished he'd tell me to go home. Tonight, I was determined to stick to the rules, no matter what. No extra glances, no lingering thoughts. I just had to get through the night. The first couple of hours passed without incident. Midnight came and went, and I made my rounds, checking each corridor and room as instructed. The silence was heavy, but it was almost comforting compared to the horrors I'd witnessed the night before. I kept my eyes down, avoiding the west corridor altogether. Around 1:45 a.m., I thought I heard something, a faint, rustling sound from outside. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently. It sounded like it was coming from the bleachers. Rule number 3 came to mind. If you see movement in the bleachers, do not investigate alone. Call for backup. I pulled out my walkie-talkie, but Hank's voice crackled through before I could speak. Stay out of the bleachers, he said, his tone sharp. You understand? Yeah, I replied, trying to mask my fear. But I think there's someone there. He didn't answer, and after a tense silence I heard him sigh. Keep moving. I'll take care of it, he muttered before the line went dead. I took a deep breath, willing myself to keep going. But as I turned back down the corridor, a shadow flitted across the monitor screen in the control room. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the screen. In the bleachers, I saw them. 3 figures, all seated in the middle row. They were still, watching the field with a strange intensity. The lights caught their faces just enough for me to see their blank, empty expressions. Their skin looked pale and waxy, as if they hadn't seen daylight in years. Then, all at once, their heads snapped in my direction. I froze, feeling my blood turn to ice. They couldn't actually see me, right? But the figures' heads continued to turn, as if tracking me through the monitors. I backed away, trying to pull my gaze from the screen, but something about their stares held me in place. And then, I noticed something else, a 4th figure standing at the edge of the bleachers. It wore a dark hoodie, its face hidden, and it seemed to be watching the 3 seated figures. A chill swept over me, and I realized I was holding my breath. Suddenly, the monitor flickered, and the 4th figure's face came into focus. It was a face I recognized all too well. It was me. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled back from the monitor. I knew I hadn't set foot in the bleachers. I'd been right here, watching from the control room, but there was no mistaking it. The person in the hoodie with my face was standing in the bleachers, looking at those 3 strange figures as if I belonged there. The monitor flickered again, and when the image cleared, the figures were gone. The bleachers were empty. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the vision, but the unease stayed with me. I wasn't imagining things, I knew what I'd seen. It was as if the stadium was playing tricks on me, warping reality itself. I could feel a presence, something dark and ancient, lurking in every shadowed corner. It was nearly 3 a.m. by the time I gathered the courage to leave the control room for my next round. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I made my way to the visitor's locker room for the mirror check. This time, I could hardly look at myself as I approached the mirror, remembering the twisted grin from the night before. But I had to follow the rules. I had no choice. I stood in front of the mirror, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, and counted to 5 in my head. My reflection stared back at me, its eyes cold and unblinking. My stomach knotted as I reached the count of 5, half expecting the reflection to grin or blink twice. But this time, it did nothing. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding over me. I turned to leave, but then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the mirror. Stay. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned back, dreading what I might see. My reflection stood there, still and silent, but its eyes, They weren't mine. They were dark, hollow, almost hungry. "Stay," it whispered again, its voice barely a breath, but the words chilled me to the bone. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I turned and bolted from the locker room. My footsteps echoed down the empty corridor, the word "stay" ringing in my ears. I forced myself to finish my rounds, but the whispers followed me, barely audible, like a shadow breathing down my neck. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the stadium itself was alive, a living, breathing entity that wanted me there, permanently. When my shift ended, I didn't see Hank. The break room was empty, and there was no sign of him anywhere in the stadium. I hurried to my car, not bothering to check in, desperate to escape. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see my own face staring back with that twisted grin. The road behind me was empty, but I could still hear the whisper, faint but clear. "Stay." The drive home felt surreal, like I was in a fog, my mind replaying the events from the night. The figures in the bleachers, the reflection in the mirror that wasn't quite mine, and that whisper, "Stay." The word echoed in my head, gnawing at me. I debated not going back, but something pulled me in, like the stadium had a grip on me. Maybe it was fear of breaking the rules. Maybe it was curiosity. Either way, when the clock struck 11 the next night, I was back. Hank wasn't waiting at the entrance this time. The stadium was eerily quiet, and for the first time, I felt completely alone. No faint sounds, no ambient hum. Just an oppressive silence that swallowed everything. I found a note taped to the control room door, written in Hank's unmistakably shaky handwriting. "Tonight, follow the rules exactly. You're almost done. But one last thing, avoid the field at all costs. If you end up there, well, don't." My stomach twisted as I read it. The rules were already disturbing, but Hank had never warned me like this before. It felt final, like he knew something I didn't. With the note crumpled in my hand, I began my rounds. Midnight passed in an unsettling calm, but that didn't ease my nerves. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound louder. The silence hung heavy around me as I walked down the endless hallways. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it. The distant cheering again. The sound floated up from the field, faint but unmistakable, like a game was happening just out of sight. I gritted my teeth, remembering the rule. If you hear cheering, check the monitors. Make sure the field is empty. I glanced at the monitor, expecting to see nothing, but this time, the field wasn't empty. A full crowd filled the bleachers, faces blank and blurry, all staring at the field with eerie stillness. On the field itself, players stood frozen in position, as if paused mid-game. Their jerseys were faded, like old film negatives, their faces expressionless and shadowed. It looked like a scene frozen in time, a snapshot of something that had happened long ago, or something that shouldn't be happening at all. Then, slowly, each figure in the bleachers turned, all of them looking directly at the camera. A wave of nausea washed over me as I watched them, feeling their empty eyes bore into me. They seemed to be waiting, expectant, as if waiting for me to join them. I shut off the monitor, my heart pounding. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I forced myself to keep moving, even as dread settled in my stomach. At 2:50 a.m., I was back in the visitors' locker room for the mirror check. I hesitated at the door, the memory of the reflection's smile haunting me, but I couldn't skip it. Not now, not with whatever was going on. I stepped in front of the mirror, counting slowly in my head, forcing myself to meet my own gaze. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Nothing happened. My reflection didn't smile, didn't blink twice. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding over me. But then I heard it again. "Stay." The whisper was louder this time, almost demanding, and I felt a pressure around me, like invisible hands pushing me forward. My heart pounded as I backed away, but something was drawing me toward the door that led to the field. The words from Hank's note echoed in my mind. Avoid the field at all costs. But the pull was too strong, as if the stadium itself was guiding me. I felt my feet move, almost against my will, my mind hazy, as I pushed open the door and stepped onto the field. The lights were blinding, illuminating the entire stadium in an unnatural, stark glow. The stands were full, every seat occupied by a shadowy figure, all staring at me in perfect silence. In the center of the field stood a lone figure, wearing the same faded visitor's jersey. My heart dropped as I recognized him. It was me, or something that looked like me. The figure's face was an exact mirror of mine, but its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to devour the light. "Welcome," it said, its voice an echo of my own, twisted and warped. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure smiled, that horrible, too-wide grin stretching across its face. "You followed the rules," it said, almost mockingly. "But did you ever ask whose rules they were?" My head spun as it stepped closer, its empty eyes boring into me. I tried to move, to turn, but the stadium seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the stench of old sweat and something metallic, something like blood. The crowd in the bleachers started to clap, slowly at first, then faster, the sound building into a deafening roar. The field spun around me as the figure's laughter mingled with the applause, a sound that felt like nails scraping against my soul. "Stay," it whispered again, leaning close, its face inches from mine. Its voice was no longer mine, but something ancient, dark, and hungry. I forced my body to move, stumbling backward, and the stadium began to fade. The lights dimmed, the laughter echoed and then quieted. I don't remember how I got out, but I ran, sprinting through the empty corridors until I burst through the exit doors and into the cold night air. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The next day, I went back to the stadium to quit. But when I arrived, there was no sign of Hank. In fact, no one knew who he was. They told me the night shift position had been open for years. No one stayed for more than a few days. And the rules? They laughed. No one had ever posted any rules for the night shift. I didn't stick around to argue. As I left, I glanced back at the empty stadium, feeling its eyes on me, that sinister whisper echoing in my mind. Stay. It wanted me to stay, and I knew that somehow it would always be waiting for me, watching.